Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. Those of you that are here live and also viewing the recording after the fact, I welcome you to our live tutorial today on mastering the requirements review process. I'm going to cover a few things today related to the requirements review process. Most of them are the steps that you take actually in setting up the meeting and hosting the meeting, but there's also a large portion of it that's going to cover the steps that you need to take in advance to make sure that you're making the most out of that. So really quick, we'll start with why we love requirements. We think that they're going to continue to be around for a long time and become increasingly important as the products that you're designing and working with become even more complex going forward. We'll talk about planning and executing your review meetings from start to finish, and then how to make the most of that investment. So by default, your review meetings, depending on the size of your company and the size of the project, it doesn't really matter because no matter what, it's a huge investment to have multiple people, sometimes very large teams that are all the relevant stakeholders that are involved in these discussions. So just right out of the gate, it's going to take you a long time. And it's going to use up a lot of time because everybody's on the clock. So we're going to make sure that you're able to make the most of that time. And then we're going to talk about human factors in requirement reviews. So the process that you set up for the way your requirements are written and the way your team is expected to follow those rules and standards that you create, and sort of the human involvement in that aspect, and making sure that you're taking into account the limitations that everybody has going in. And then lastly, we'll talk about the steps that you can take to improve your overall process and the tools that we have that can help you with that as well. So on the QRA team today, we have myself, I'm in sales here at QRA, and then also managing the chat, we have Olivia Kenny in our marketing team. She's the one that sent you the emails to remind you that the tutorial is coming up. So thank you, Olivia, for that, and thank you for joining. If you do have any questions as we go along, there is a chat window available within the Zoom screen here. So depending what browser you're using, it might look a little bit different, but either at the bottom or the top, you'll see that chat icon. Questions will only be visible to Olivia. She'll read out the questions at different points during the tutorial. So don't worry about interrupting at any time that you have a question. Just go ahead and type it in there and we'll address those at a couple of points during the tutorial. Next up, we want to hear your opinion. We've done this for the last couple of tutorials that we've hosted, and we really appreciate those of you that have taken the time to give us some feedback on this. It's not about the tool or what you think of QRA or anything like that. It's just the actual opinion on the content of this tutorial. We're always trying to make them better, trying to make them relevant to what our attendees are looking for. So it's just a 2-question survey. One, how likely are you to recommend this to somebody else in your industry or on your team? And then secondly, what's the number one factor influencing your answer? So that's just to give us kind of a baseline on the quality of the content and how relevant it is to what you're looking for. And if you do that, we will send you, as a thank you, a PDF copy of this presentation so you can go and review the information. But also there's a lot of extra materials that they're referencing during this talk. So there'll be links within that to click on those as well. So it's kind of a one-stop shop to get all of the follow-up resources along with the links if you want to go back and revisit anything that we talked about here today. That will be available as soon as you fill out that survey for us. So we do appreciate that. That link will be sent by email, something a little bit different this time. Right at the end of the tutorial, we'll be sending out that email so you have access to it right away. Then later on, a recording will be sent to you by another one of our team members here. So those will be coming as 2 separate messages. That's just to make sure that you get the tutorial survey right away. The follow-up message with the recording will be sent as soon as we have the recording up and available. So here's the screen of what will be included in your follow-up links. In the message that you get, each of these will be clickable. So you can go through to the tutorial itself, the different resources that we're going to mention, like the guide that's on the same topic, Mastering the Review Process, as well as our ears guide, and a link to book a free one-to-one consultation will be there as well. So keep your eyes open for that when you do get your slideshow. And here are a couple of previous related tutorials that will be included in that as well. So links to Rebecca's webinar from last month on teaching junior engineers how to author requirements, and the one before that I hosted on functional versus non-functional requirements. I talked about French fries and money and systems and in and out. It got a little weird, but we got good feedback on it. So hopefully everyone there enjoyed that. This sort of, we didn't do it on purpose, but it is sort of working out to be a series. So then functional versus non-functional, we covered how to gather requirements, so different methods that you can use in the process of developing your original requirements document. Then Rebecca hosted hers on knowledge transfer and how to teach junior engineers how to write requirements, which also acted as sort of a crash course on requirements engineering yourself as well. So please do, if you haven't checked those out, feel free when you get that presentation to check those out as well. This is kind of a natural next step to those, but certainly you don't need to have those as a prerequisite for what we're going to talk about today, which is mastering the requirements review process. So we do have a guide and checklist available that we're going to be referencing throughout. Of course, we're going to be expanding on a lot of the content that's in there as well, but we will have a link available to that. You can also find it on qracorp.com. So getting started. Why do we love requirements? So our whole company, our big focus right now is on our product QV Scribe, which is to help teams write requirements, get everybody on the same page with how these requirements are written. And in order to go in that direction, we need to believe that requirements are not only necessary, but they're going to be necessary in the future as these designs and the products that you're working on continually to get continue to get more complex and difficult to manage. So why do we love requirements? Just really quick, communication. So it's the ability to take what is in your head and get it down on paper in a way that other people can interact with it and get everybody on the same page with the product that you're designing. So if you're on a really small team, you'll use an example. So let's go even before the team. So maybe you're designing an app, a mobile app, and it's just by yourself. It's an idea that you came up with on your own, and you're designing this app. That communication, your list of requirements for what this needs to do can exist entirely in your head. You still have requirements, but they're all up in your head and there's no need to communicate it with anybody else. You can still go through the process just for your own sake to get it down on paper and to make sure that you're covering everything. But if it's something that's really simple and you're the only person involved, requirements might not be necessary. But as projects become more complex, even if there's only one person working on it, you still want to go through that process on your own. But of course, as more people get introduced, you have different stakeholders that are involved in the decision making on how this product is going to look, how it's going to feel, who's going to be involved in designing it. Maybe you have interdisciplinary teams that are working on it. So this grows and grows and grows. And for most companies that we work with, you couldn't even rattle off the list of stakeholders that are involved off the top of your head. So that communication becomes more and more important as your product scales. Now you do have challenges with smaller teams as well, because if it's just you or a small team that's working on something, you don't have that expertise of all the different people. So the best practices and all of the industry lessons that could be learned and experience that could be factored in, you're responsible for all of that. So there's kind of pros and cons, but that communication with larger projects especially is the really important part of requirements. So secondly is coordination. So if you have different systems that all need to be working together, requirements are a great way to get that down in a manageable system that you know the factors that are going in and the outputs that this team is going to be working on, and then your responsibility is to do this. And you know that all of those are going to come together. You're in a coordinated effort of who's handling what, making sure that everybody's on the same page. Completeness. So you can look at that model, look at the requirements that you've put together and see that everything has been covered. So you can look at it from a number of different angles. There's different approaches like we talked about in the elicitation section of our last tutorial, where you're making sure that you've covered all of your bases. And lastly is confirmation. So before you actually go through the effort of coding this product, if it's software, designing the product or getting it to the manufacturer for them to do the final production of it, you want to confirm with your stakeholders that yes, this is going to meet the needs of what the business side has asked for, what our stakeholders or what our shareholders need this product to do, and it's going to be compatible with the other products that we offer and how it fits into the big picture. So it's confirmation before you start the design. And then lastly, since the other ones all started with C, consummation, it's a little weak, okay? But, I'll talk about this a little bit later. I used to be a preacher, so I wanted to keep the C's. So consummation, that's when you get into, once the product is done and you're confirming that what's been delivered is what it is that you asked for, you go back to those requirements documents to make sure that you signed off on everything to make sure that it's complete. So there it is, James Carr's 5 C's of why we love requirements. So in this process, some adaptation will be required. I'm going to be mostly talking about large organizations, large complex products. But if somebody says, James, show me how to write the best requirements for a boat. Well, your requirements list for that kayak are going to be very, 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 very different than that cruise ship that you have in the background. So you need to keep an eye on that. and make sure that what you're looking at here, you're tailoring to your own experience with it. So we will be focusing more on large complex products. If you are working on a smaller team, you can adapt some of these principles to the way that you see yourselves using it. So a little disclaimer there that some adaptation will be required. So basic steps in the review process. So these are the 5 steps that we're going to walk through. These are straight out of our guide that's on the website. So decide how to conduct the review, identify the participants and book a time to do it, set the stage, so that's making the necessary preparations for the meeting to make sure you get the most out of it, conduct the actual review itself, and then complete the follow-up tasks for afterwards. So step 1 here is decide how to conduct the review. So first of all, is it going to be formal or informal? So in a formal review, you're going through each requirement line by line and making sure that everybody's on the same page, that there's complete agreement in it. If you're doing an informal review, it might be that you're only looking at certain requirements, or maybe everybody's looked at the document in advance and just going to skip around talking about the particular issues that people have, depending on the complexity and also, I guess, the criticality of the project that you're working on. That's going to dictate how formal this process needs to be. So it'll be up to you to decide what the best fit is for that. Next is to decide if this particular review that you're putting together is going to have a broad approach or a focused approach. So if it's broad, then you're talking about the entire project, everything all together. If it's focused, you might be taking a subset of the requirements or a certain list of requirements, or maybe you're reviewing a specification that your team has on file, but you're choosing at this point to focus on what level you're going to be reviewing these. So if you are doing focused reviews that are all part of a larger review that you're going to be doing, it is best to review each of those individually before doing a final broad review. But at some point before the final approval is done, all of those requirements should be looked at together in a more broad way as well. So next is decide whether you want to host this meeting on-site or off-site. So that would be, if you're working on a team that's maybe all located in the same office, to eliminate distractions and help make sure that everybody's focused and not jumping out to different meetings or running out to their desk for a second to do something, you might consider having it off-site. There's a little bit of a cost to book a room for it, but with the cost of everybody that's involved in these meetings, that would be minimal. So, if you want to go off-site, book a hotel room somewhere, get some snacks going, have a good time, get that set up. So that's a good option as well to keep everybody focused. And then the last decision is whether this is going to be face-to-face or remote. So if you have stakeholders that are in different countries or different states, different provinces, then you need to make the decision on whether it's okay to do to have people join remotely. If you do decide to do it remotely, make sure you have the technology in place to be able to do that in a way that everybody's able to engage with the content, everybody can hear everyone, that you have that part really taken care of to make the most of it. So another alternative for that is if you're doing face-to-face meetings, then you could have it at like a central hub. So if you do it in a hub state, a hub airport where everybody flies into, you can go to that airport, book a room, meeting room right at the airport itself, hold your meetings there, whether it takes a couple of days, stay there on site, and then everybody can go back to where they were from. That just saves on the transportation costs involved in that as well. So once you've got this nailed down and you know what it is that you want to cover in your review meeting of your requirements, then you can go ahead and decide who's going to be involved with that. So first thing is to consult your stakeholder list, like we talked about in my last one. At this point, you should have a list of the stakeholders that are involved in this process. So they are the ones that actually are involved and invested in the decision that's being made. So that could be anywhere from the business side that's been listening to the customers and deciding what it is that they want to prioritize with this product that you're rolling out. It could be the end users that are going to be actually involved in using the tool, and those that are going to be developing it and designing it as well as, of course, your authors and managers that are writing the requirements as well. So it's good to have wide representation here. You don't want just, a smaller group of the same people. So just authors or just managers getting together to review these. You really want to bring the stakeholders in so that everybody who's involved in this decision and those that are ultimately going to be approving the product are on the same page with what you've come up with in this list of requirements. And customer representatives, if applicable as well, that could be your shareholders or your business team that's involved in that or whatever. People that are going to be signing off on this, make sure that they're represented in this discussion as well. And then lastly, This could be the same person, a facilitator and an editor. Preferably, you'd have two separate people to do that. But it's important to have this not be one of your regular stakeholders. So as the editor, you want somebody who's familiar with your process of writing requirements, somebody that knows how the requirement should be written and can use the tools that you're using to be able to keep control of the conversation and keep up with that. But that's a really time-consuming task, and it's very intense mentally to be able to keep up with what everybody's saying and make the changes to the document while still brainstorming yourself and trying to think through these requirements. So if at all possible, have somebody who's not directly involved in this project that's taking care of those two things. And then for a facilitator, you are dealing with different personalities that are going to be in the room. You're going to have different priorities, and those different stakeholders, sometimes it can get intense in these meetings. I've witnessed some. I've been involved in conversations about others that have happened where, if you're criticizing a way that a requirement is written or a part of the requirement document that's missing, that's somebody's handiwork. In some cases, people are working on these for weeks or months, and so that's their baby. That's something that they've spent a lot of time and effort in clarifying and perfecting and reading over and over and over and trying to get it just right. And so when somebody comes in and says, "Hey, this is all wrong," and "No, you shouldn't have done it that way," and "We agreed we're not going to write it like that," it can be intense. And whether people are being mean about it or not doesn't really matter. Tempers are going to rise. At some point when you're going through that process. So it's good to have somebody who's facilitating who can really manage the room, keep track on how engaged people are, making sure that people are being asked their opinion, because everybody might not be willing to speak up in that process as well. So having a good facilitator, again, preferably somebody who's not directly involved in the document itself, so that they can just be focused on seeing if it's time for a break or making sure that the people that are involved are being heard as you move along. So those are two really important people to be there as well. So for step 3, about setting the stage. So these are steps that you can take immediately before this meeting comes about to make sure that everybody's on the same page with what's going to be covered, make sure they're familiar with the content before you go in. Because once the clock starts and you've got everybody gathered together, this becomes really, really expensive. You're investing a lot of time, you're investing a lot of project money on this process to have all these people together. So you want to make sure that when you're actually in the review meeting itself, you're only covering the things that can only be covered during that meeting. So I'd say, first of all, with regards to the quality of the requirements themselves, start with high quality and keep that quality high throughout the entire process. And what I mean by that is it's important to keep the stakeholders involved. So before you get to this review meeting, stakeholders should be involved throughout in the process of reading what's been written so far. It's common to want to perfect all of your requirements before sending them off to the other stakeholders or have them see what's going on, but it is important to have them involved in the process as you move along. So when I say start with high quality, I mean the way that the requirement is actually structured, the language that's being used, and the way that you present the content should always be of high quality. So that's a low risk of misinterpretation, making sure that everybody's on the same page with the meaning of it, whether or not they agree with the content of the requirement. They should always be written in a way that it's unambiguous and it's clear the intent and the actual meaning behind the requirement itself. Next is to keep your stakeholders involved. So there's sort of two different things going on here. First, you want to make sure that the quality level is high so that each requirement that's written is, like I said, clear, concise, testable, that everybody's in agreement with the meaning of it. But you don't have to wait until the entire document is perfect before you get the stakeholders involved. So be constantly reviewing the quality and making sure that what's being written is clear, but also you want to keep the stakeholders involved at various points. So don't wait until the whole document is complete before you bring it up to somebody to review. Say, here's what we're working on so far. Here are the sections that we've covered. Here's what we have. Here's what we've created so far. What do you think about what we have so far? But it is important that in that document, you're not sending them garbage that's hard to read, that it's ambiguous, that they have to read it over and over to figure out what the meaning is. Your requirements aren't too long, that it becomes difficult to pull out the meanings of them. Keep it high quality, but they don't need to be necessarily entirely complete as you're bringing the stakeholders involved. Along those same lines, we would encourage you to require a standard of quality before submission. So if you are going to be going through the process of reviewing these requirements together as a team and taking that time to do it, you don't want to spend that meeting reviewing the content, the quality of the requirement. So you don't want to be talking about, oh, what do you mean by this? And okay, well, we should split this into 2 separate requirements, or should we move this up? Because everybody's on the clock, and that's a huge waste of time. So there's a few different ways that you can review the quality of these. Some people will outsource that, so you send it out to a company to clean it up and make sure that the imperatives are used correctly and do kind of these manual checks. Of course, here at QRA, if you're familiar with us at all, you would know that our tool QV Scribe is designed for that very purpose. So it can do a preliminary check of your document, make sure that the imperatives are being used correctly, that the terms are consistent, that the units are consistent, that there aren't any blatant problems with the language that's being used, and get that level of quality to a certain height before you move on to review, where everybody's on the same page, getting everybody on the same page with how the document is actually written. So when you come to their meeting, you can focus on the content of the requirements instead of focusing on the syntax and those nitpicky things. So our preference is to use QV Scribe, which I'll show you in just a couple of minutes here. We'll do a run through of a document of what you would do before the requirements process, before the review meeting would be involved. So next, you can distribute the requirements, the set of requirements to participants, everybody that's going to be involved in the call. Before you actually go to that meeting, everyone should have a chance to review that document. So QV Scribe has a PDF report that you can send. So if you do have your set of requirements already, it's nicely laid out with the quality score. Potential issues that could be that would need to be that would need to be discussed will already be highlighted in that document. So then each person can go through, make their own notes about what they want to talk about, so that as you're reviewing these, it's not everybody's first time reading it and trying to understand it. Everybody that's on this call has already had a chance to digest the requirements as a whole before you get to that time where everybody's on the clock. Get everyone to do their homework, just talked about that. And lastly, get everyone to prepare for out of office status. So if this is going to be a 2 or 3 day process that you're involved with, maybe it's a big review that you're doing, maybe you're taking a week to do it, your team should be prepared to let the other tasks that they're working on go. So treat it like a vacation, treat it like this is time that I'm going to be out of the office, because everybody needs to be focused on reviewing those requirements, because everybody has a different perspective. Everybody's coming at this problem with different priorities and a different lens. So it's really important at each level, even if it's not something that you plan to speak to directly, that you are engaged in that conversation. So it's important to make sure that everybody who's going to be on the call is prepared for that out of office status. So you may be wondering why I gathered you here. So this came from some feedback that we've gotten on previous tutorials, actually, where basically we were asked, maybe it's just our Canadian way, to stop apologizing for the reason that we're hosting this. The reason that we're doing this is to let people know about QV Scribe and what our tools do. So what I want to do now is actually give you a walkthrough of our tool and how we think that QV Scribe can help in your review process, and how our customers are actually using QV Scribe as a part of their requirements review process. So I will jump over to QV Scribe here. Just looking at the people that have registered for this tutorial, seem to be a larger focus on medical device industry. So we have a number of different sample documents that we use. This particular one is for a pacemaker. So it's a high level specification of what this pacemaker should do in different scenarios. So it's a good example because it's a complex document, but it's not too long. So even if this isn't relevant to your industry, we can definitely set up a call with you to go through either one of your own documents or a document that's specific to the industry that you're working in. So this is a pacemaker system specification. So we're talking about the actual functional requirements for the most part for this pacemaker device. So if we go through here, you can see on the right-hand side, the QV Scribe scores are indicated between 1 and 5, and that's based on the language that's being used in the requirements. So what QV Scribe does, it acts as a central point for you to include the language that you want to include in your requirements and keep everybody on the same page with the language that you've decided to use. So as I'm looking through this list here, I can see that this overall document has a score of 3 out of 5, but we have a number of requirements here that have some pretty big problems. So most of these that you see that have a score of 1 out of 5 have a problem with the imperatives. So the consistent use of shall statements, so making sure that each requirement has shall once and only once is the first check that's being done. So if you have multiple imperatives, that's going to be flagged there. Some other issues would be vague language. So There are certain words that are a sign that your requirement might be unnecessarily vague, or it could be difficult to interpret. And so what QVScribe does, there's a default library that comes with it. About 150 keywords are triggered. So as you're looking through this document, you might have some words that you've included in there that are fine in day-to-day conversation, or maybe even if you're talking about this project with a colleague side by side. But that language isn't appropriate for a requirements document like this, because you have so many different stakeholders. Maybe you have different people in different regions that are working on it, and you just can't afford to have somebody misunderstand what you are writing in a requirement. So what we found was, if there are requirements that are vague, a lot of the times there are like crutch words that people use instead of actually specifying what they mean by that requirement statement. They'll use these other words, like saying that a system will be easy to use without quantifying what is meant by that. Or you might say that something should happen immediately. You will have an understanding of what is meant by immediately, but the other person who picks it up down the road will have a completely different understanding of what is actually acceptable for that word. So QVScribe first will check for that quality. Then there's a consistency and similarity check, these different tabs that I'll show you after that. So let's dive into the quality analysis a little bit here. First, we'll look at these are the different issues that QVScribe is checking for. So everything that you see that's written in the darker black there, these are present in this document. So I can click on any one of these issues and filter all of these results. So already I've taken what's just in a long document form, and I can filter it down to say, okay, I'm going to deal with the issues of, say, vague words. And this is going to show me all the requirements that contain some sort of issue with the vague language. So if I click this one at the bottom here, we can see during fallback, the ATR detection algorithm determines that the atrial tachycardia is over. The following shall occur. Fallback is terminated immediately. The mode is switched back to normal. So you can see that there's 3 different issues here, 2 that are in blue, 1 purple, and 1 red. They're listed in 2 different categories here. So one is the quality score. So that means the score that you see there of 2 out of 5 is caused by these 2 issues together. So if there were only 1 instance of vague language, you can see some of these have a 3 out of 5, then you'd get that higher score. But since there's 2 issues present, it goes down to a 2, because that presents a higher risk, because you actually have 2 separate issues to look at. And then the other one you see here is actually a quality warning. We have a few of our quality indicators that are actually they don't actually impact the score. Those are indicated by this little triangle that's here next to the requirement itself. And then they're listed here in a separate category. So in this case, it's just pointing out that this requirement is written in passive voice, which is not a best practice. And the reason for that is, instead of specifying who or what is actually responsible, saying the system shall do this, you're saying this is what will happen. So you're not specifying who or what is responsible for actually accomplishing that requirement, which can lead to problems with verification, or problems with assuming that another team is taking care of that, or it's going to be covered by another system. So by actually specifying, the pacemaker control system shall, and saying what that system is responsible for, you can be a lot more direct with the meaning and reduce the risk that somebody's going to misunderstand that. So overall, passive voice does not impact the score, because a lot of times an entire document is written in passive voice. There are also some false positives. Maybe there's a passive voice that's there that's detected that's in a different part of the requirement. So this natural language processing algorithm is just looking for the use of passive voice, and then you can look at it to check. So in this case, it is actually a problem. So I'd recommend changing that to the active voice. So actually saying the pacemaker system shall, and listing it that way. So moving on to the other issues that are here, we have 1 immediately. So fallback is terminated immediately. So if this is a non-functional or functional requirement where you're describing the behavior of the system and not actually the performance of it, you don't need to get into time constraints. You're not actually talking about how you'll verify this requirement. So by adding that word immediately, you're giving the illusion that there's some sort of performance metric here, when really you're not being specific enough to ask for that, but you're going to give the impression that there is a time constraint here. So maybe at this level, it would be appropriate to add the time. So if it is really important that this fallback is terminated within 1 second, or within half a second, or 0.2 of a second, then you can change that here. If you determine that at this level you're not getting into the actual performance of the system, but just describing the behavior, then maybe the best practice is just to take that out. So I can remove that word, and I can reanalyze the requirement. So we'll just reanalyze this one requirement. it now gets a score of 3 out of 5 because we still have one instance of vague language here, which is the word normal. Now, I picked this one on purpose because you will find when you're using a tool like this, it's pulling out all the times that these different potentially problematic terms are being used. So there's this handshake involved between the user that's looking at the tool and the results that the tool is showing. So the purpose of QVscribe is to bring to your attention areas that might be a concern. So for example, if you had a requirement that said the detection algorithm shall work in the normal way, that would be vague. You're not being clear with what that even means. You're referencing some sort of other understanding or assuming that somebody has an understanding of what the normal way is. But in this case, normal is actually one of the modes that this tool has. So when you come across something like this and you're reviewing a document with QVscribe, you have really 3 options. One, you can change the word here. So in this case, I don't think that's the right course of action because we're talking about a mode. Secondly, I can acknowledge that, yeah, I've looked at this and it's okay. The way that normal is being used here is fine. And then the third option is, okay, for this document or for this type of document that we're working on, I don't want to be notified when the word normal comes up. And so you can actually go to a configuration that's up here. And with QVscribe for Teams, which is our enterprise solution, only certain people will have access to this configuration file. So you need to actually be authorized to be able to go and make changes to these configurations. Your default users won't be able to go in and make changes to the configurations, but they can choose which configuration to use for their file. So if I look at the list of vague words here, this is by default. My font's a little just a little bit larger here. So I can look through this list and see all the different terms that are being flagged as vague. And maybe for this document, I don't want the word normal flagged anymore. So I can just remove that from the list. And now this is in the list of suggested words. So if I want to go back in and add it later on, I can do that. There it is. So I can add it back in later on. And then also, if there are other terms maybe specific to the industry that I'm working in, specific to the region that this product is going to be deployed in, specific to the actual product that I'm working on, if there's other language that you don't want to have included or that you want QVscribe to check for, you can add them. So you can just type in any word that you want to include on that list, and this will fall under the same rules as the vague language that we have here. And that's the same for any of the checks here. So our imperative check by default is looking for everything that's on the right here. For this document, we're checking for shall, must, and will. Perhaps for your document, you're only using the word shall, so I'd remove these other words from the list as well. So this is a really important feature for QVscribe because this is actually how you're getting your team not only to follow best practices for requirement writing, but this is how you actually keep your team on the same page. So you decide not, we don't want you to follow our standard. We've created these rules based on the industries that we've worked in and the experiences that we've had, and rules like the INCOSE guide for writing requirements. Those all speak to what's included in this default configuration, but you need to determine as a team with each of these issues how you want them to be handled. So you can build your own list, and what QVscribe will do is enable you to do types of checks that were never possible before. The process of reviewing every person's work before going into a review meeting to make sure that none of these words are used or that they're used in the proper way is a very time-consuming, almost to the point that you wouldn't even bother doing it because it just takes so much time to go through and check for these things manually. But with a tool like QVscribe, you can actually start thinking about that. So right out of the box, you're going to be getting great results and be able to see right away where your document might need work. But then over time, you'll slowly start to add and remove different words from the list and really make it your own and actually have different configurations for different projects. So that's the way that our teams are using QVscribe today. Our customers are using it to save time in their process and actually using it to define the standard of how does our organization or how does our team approach the requirements in their documents. So we'll just exit out of that for now. But with each one, you have the option to, of course, change the document itself. You can skip over it, or you can remove it from the configuration so you don't see that word anymore. And specific to your review meetings, the way that you would use this and the way that some of our customers are using it is you would require a certain overall score before a document can be submitted for review. So of course, there's going to be things that are flagged that you look at it and read it in context and go, you know what? I actually think that's the best way to write it in this context. Or maybe, yeah, I see why normal could be a problem, but in this case, I'm okay with it. And as long as you achieve that certain level of quality, then it eliminates the vast majority of the issues that are being faced. So you've already dealt with the issue of imperatives. You've dealt with the vague language. You've dealt with non-specific temporal words like immediately, things like that. So this is all taken care of before you get to that review meeting, so that none of the time that's spent in that review meeting is actually talking about how are we going to say this or what do you mean by that. But you can actually focus on the content of the document itself, which really, for the subject matter experts and the stakeholders that you have together in that meeting, that's the purpose of the meeting, is to review the content of it. You don't want to get bogged down with this kind of tedious, repetitive stuff that's involved with it. And even if your team isn't doing formal review meetings like we're talking about today, just that process of checking through a document and being able to make sure that everyone is using the same language and that you're following these best practices in a controlled way can be a huge time saver for your team. So that's the quality analysis. That's looking at, for example, vague language. If we give another example here, maybe we want to check for any time that multiple imperatives were used in the document. You can see that that was a big problem with this one. So I can select any of these here and it will actually show me where the issues are highlighted. So you can see, skipping to any of these, all of the issues are being highlighted right on the document itself. So this one, for example, the accelerometer shall determine the rate increase of the pacing rate. The recovery time shall be the time required for the rate to fall. So at best, this requirement is two requirements put together that should be split. But they are under one number here. So the problem that would come with a requirement like this, if somebody is at a review meeting and they say, hey, I want to talk about 5.7.5, and you go to this, whenever somebody is reviewing this, they have to read both requirements, even if maybe the issue is only with one of them. So that's why it's really important to make these requirements singular. And then also, if you're planning to use a requirements management tool down the road, it's absolutely imperative that before you put the requirements into that database, that they are singular. So you have one imperative for each requirement, that each requirement is singular, because those are going to be reused and tagged and connected to other requirements. And to get meaningful information out of that, a first step is to make sure that you've gone through that. So one of our customers, very large customer of ours, went through the process. They actually decided back in 2015 that they were going to start using a requirements management tool. And they took that 5-year process to actually go through all of their specifications and all of their backlogs to make sure that all of the requirements were ready for that move. And just now they're starting to go through that process of moving the requirements into a requirements management system. So it is a very tedious, painstaking process to go through and do that, but it's important because that's how you can get the meaningful information. And in the long term, you'll save a lot more time than it takes to invest in cleaning up your documents in this way. So that's it for the quality analysis. Moving to consistency, I made some changes to the document here, so it's just going to reanalyze the document. So again, that quality check, consistency, and similarity are done. This document has about 200 requirements in it. So you see each of those being done here. Now they're being checked. So the first one is a check for the units. So this is pulling out all the units that are used in the document, so I can go through and make sure that they're being used consistently. This one doesn't have a lot of units in it, but I can see here when I go to volt, that this one, you can see volt is highlighted here twice, 5 volts and between 5 volts and 0.5 volts. But this other one immediately brought to my attention that one has the unit and one doesn't. So if this was written somewhere else in the document where the other one wasn't right next to it, it wouldn't, of course, catch that the unit is missing. But being able to see them together here points out to me immediately that, oh, I'm actually missing the unit there. So I can update that to include that. But this is to make sure that if you're maybe talking in different regions, that you're keeping everybody on the same page in terms of what system of units is being used. You don't have a mixture of inches in one place and centimeters somewhere else. And you can actually use this filter to track those down as well. So next is for terms consistency. So this is, again, using natural language processing to pull out all of the terms that are used throughout this document. So you'll see that some of them are a single word and then others have multiple words in them. So this isn't a list of all of the words that are used in the document. It's just pulling out the nouns. So you can actually see the list of terms. This is learned, this natural language processing library was trained outside of your document. So you actually don't need to use any of your information in the natural language processing part of this. It comes pre-trained, so it's just able to pull out the nouns automatically. But you would use this to make sure that maybe if you have multiple people working on a project or you've copy and pasted from different sources, that you're using terms consistently throughout. So I can see here, I've used the word device 20 times in this, and then I've also talked about system 9 times. So what I'd ask myself as I'm scrolling through this list is, are those the same thing? Is there a reason to differentiate between some places I'm talking about the device shall and other places I'm talking about the system? One example that came out to me very early on when I was looking through this is that we have the user identified here. So I can go through and say the user shall have the option of viewing this. The user is instructed to do this. Elsewhere in this document, I can see from that list of terms that we're also talking about a physician. And then somewhere else, we're talking about a patient. So if in this document, sometimes there's a patient and then other times we're talking about the physician, how do I know who the user is? Who am I designing this feature to accommodate for? And that's not immediately clear in reading this document. So the terms analysis just makes sure that you're using those terms consistently, and you can actually have the document open here so I can go through and make the change here right now. Of course, confirm that it's right. But if this is actually talking about the patient, I can type that in. If it's talking about the physician, I can make that update here as well. Just make sure your terms are being used consistently. It will also show you similar terms below here. So if I bring this down, so we talk about if there were other similar terms that were being used here, atrial event here, for example. If there were similar terms to any of these that are being highlighted, they'd show up on this list here as well. And then lastly is a similarity analysis. So if you're dealing with a very complex safety critical systems and part of your review process is looking at each requirement next to every other requirement, that is a very long, painful process to go through. Most projects and customers that we've dealt with don't have that as a part of their process, but it is there sometimes. What the similarity analysis will do is to give you the most out of that experience with the least amount of time going into it. So instead of looking at each requirement next to every other requirement, you can take the requirements that are most likely to either have a conflict or most likely to have conflicting information, not a conflict or a repetition of the same information. So you're either contradicting yourself or you have unnecessary repetition. QVScribe will help you check for those. So for example, I can use this slider here, bring the threshold up to 100%, and it will show me if I have two requirements that are exactly the same. So the ventricular sensitivity shall have a value of 1.5. Why am I saying this twice? Okay, well, let's look at them in context. If I click on it here, I can see that the first instance is under this pace now state. So in one state, the requirement is that it shall have a value of 1.5. But that's also true of this other state, the power on reset state. So you'll notice that most of these requirements actually did follow the practice of not referencing the heading. So this heading is power on reset state. For each of these other ones, it actually has POR included there. So the mode POR shall have a value of this, POR pace parameter shall have a value of this, and it goes on. But here it just says the ventricular sensitivity shall have a value of 1.5. So if you remove this from the context, you're just looking at this requirement on its own, there's missing information here. So that's one of the NCOSE best practices for requirement writing, is to make sure that each requirement stands on its own without needing to reference the requirements above or below. Again, that also helps when you're getting into more advanced use of these requirements and reusing requirements. So I can actually update this on the spot to actually show the difference between them. So while in power on reset state, the ventricular sensitivity shall have a value of. So I can update that. But it's not just good for checking requirements that are exactly the same. I can also go through and see requirements that will have maybe not an exact match, but they have similar content in them. So at this time, this is just looking at the requirement, the actual syntax, so the words that are included, the characters actually. But we're working on, we're actually in a testing stage right now for a feature that would introduce semantic similarity. So it's actually looking at the meaning behind these words and comparing the meanings of your requirements with the meanings of others. So if I look through here, if I choose an example here about this pulse, again, one talking about the power on reset state, the other is talking about the pace now state. I can see that one is supposed to be 0.5, the other is supposed to be 1. So by doing the similarity analysis across a large document, I'm able to find, even if they're hundreds of pages apart, I'm able to find two requirements that look similar to one another. And then at the bottom here, everything that's the same is highlighted in red, and just the differences are highlighted in green. So I can quickly compare. Okay, 0.5 for POR, is that right? Okay, good. Pace now for the pace now state, it's at 1. Is that correct? And so you can see those differences. So if there was a conflict here, that it was saying that we're in the same mode, it's actually giving two different values, that would immediately come to your attention. So that's the quality, consistency, and similarity. Once you've improved the quality at the document level here of the particular user that's working on this requirement, you can generate a PDF report. This PDF report is customizable, so you can control which which quality scores you want to have included in that, what information you want to have included in that report. And then this will allow you to share these results with other people. So this is what we were talking about. If you're going into the review meeting, you'd actually go through the process of sending this out to everyone that's going to be on the call. And then everyone will have a chance to read through those requirements. They're presented in a very clean, easy to read way. And then the person can make notes on each of these on what they want to talk about in that review meeting. So you can see issues of multiple imperatives are highlighted. It gives the reason for it here. Now, if we're actually changing the document, it's better to do it in QVScribe itself, because then you actually are made aware if you're making changes that negatively impact the score as well. But that's how the reports can be used in the context of a review meeting to help everybody prepare for that. So overall, the goal with QVScribe is to take what the computer is good at, so identifying these problems, bring them to the user's attention, and universally presenting that same information to everybody across the team. So the whole goal is to elevate the conversation. So you're not spending these really expensive review meetings talking about the syntax and the words that you're choosing to use in your requirements. You can actually focus on the content itself. Make sure that the requirements are complete. Make sure that they make sense, that they're feasible, that they fit together, that you're not missing anything. So the human strengths are understanding the project as a whole. That's what your subject matter experts are for. They author the framework, and then they're able to solve problems as they're brought to their attention. QVScribe is there as an assistant, basically a requirement expert sitting next to you as you're writing the requirement, that's giving you feedback that says, hey, our team has decided we're not going to use that word because it can cause problems. Making sure that they're consistent in that as well. So a couple of metrics, QVScribe can actually, with some testing that's been done, this is in hours to complete a document. So you can actually see that users can review the requirements documents for misused imperatives 3 times faster than with manual methods. So some of our customers do outsource this type of work. So they'll take existing specifications or existing requirements documents that they have, send them out to an outside company, and just tell them, check for the use of shall, and they'll go through and do this manually. What you're missing there is that the people who are actually working on the requirement itself don't have the ability to learn from that experience. So with QVScribe, they're getting that feedback on the spot, and they're able to quickly improve the quality of the document as they're writing it. We do have a question.
She asks, is there a way to analyze 2 different documents separately and then compare requirements between a system level document and a subsystem or component document? For example, to look for conflicts or similarities, or do all comparisons have to be within the same document?
Great question. So the question was, is it possible to compare requirements from different documents together to make sure that there's consistency across the document? The best way to do that is actually with QVScribe for Excel. So I've been showing you QVScribe for Word so far. We do have QVScribe for Excel, and with that you can have different pages. So if you do have multiple documents, you can mark those requirements on the different sheets within Excel and then actually analyze those together as a whole. So your different requirements might have different configurations that you want to use. Maybe you're using different imperatives for different levels, or have different words that are acceptable at one level of requirements, but you don't want to include it at another level. So with those, you would want to analyze them separately, but for an overall consistency, for looking for things like similarity analysis and things like that, you can analyze them together as a set. And then another test that was done is actually looking at how the effectiveness of QVScribe increases with the larger document. So if you have a short document, maybe it's only 3 pages long, something like that, and you want to check for the consistent use of units and terms, that's something that manually, the process of just going through and finding those is pretty easy. But as your documents get bigger and longer and more complex, that time that it takes to review those types of documents manually, and every time you make a change, you have to go back and do the whole check again to make sure that you haven't conflicted with something else that's been included, that time increases very rapidly. So QVScribe, especially with larger documents, can help with that as well. So next step, in step 4, is to conduct the review. I was going to tell you a story about when I was a preacher, but we're running out of time, so I'm not going to do that. We do have another question here though. Olivia?
Does QVScribe integrate with requirements management tools? If yes, does it integrate with DOORS or DOORS NG?
Great question. That is skipping ahead a little bit. So the question was, does QVScribe integrate with requirements management tools? The answer is not today, but it is something that is in development right now. So we're actually looking for teams to work with us for the development of an integration or to help us with the beta testing for Doors NG integration that's been created already. We're also working on one for JAMA and one for Polarian. So if your team is using any of those dedicated management tools, we'd love to get in touch with you to talk about what we have so far and see if it works within your workflow. We'll get to that later on. I hope that answers your question for now, though. So moving on to step 4. So once the meeting actually starts, you slug it out line by line. So you're looking through each requirement, making sure that the different stakeholders that are there don't have any issues with what's been written. You can check the list that's in the back of the guide for mastering the requirements review process. That's over there on the right-hand side. A lot of these things are automated by QV Scribe, but it's good to check, have that checklist in mind as you're working through them. And then make small changes on the spot. So if there's something that can be repaired, everybody agrees on it, you can go ahead and make that change on the document itself. So the person who's in control of QV Scribe or in control of the document at that point would go in and make those changes. And then for larger tasks, if you come across something, oh, we realize that we're missing a section, or the formatting here is wrong, or this isn't the style that we've agreed to write in, then assign those tasks to a particular person that they are going to be responsible for achieving, for getting those together. It's important to get everybody involved. We talked about that a little bit earlier, so we'll skip over that. And then monitor the room. So make sure that everybody's engaged, everybody is having a chance to have their say, people aren't dominating the conversation. So when you actually conduct the review, it's in place. So step 5, so for the actual follow-up. So next, you want to make sure that everybody completed their follow-up tasks. So as those are being completed, you'll take all of those changes, review them for quality, preferably using QV Scribe, making sure that they don't violate any of the rules that your team has set out, and then compile the final set for review. So you're going to take all of these documents together and put them in a format where everybody can do one last check. And then you might be determined if there've been a lot of changes, it might be important to have another meeting just to make sure that everybody is in agreement with the changes that were made. If there were minor checks, then everybody could just read it on their own. And finally, complete the final sign off of it. So that's sort of the process step by step to go through of hosting the meeting. But there are steps that can be looked at before you actually get into the review itself. So what should you do before the review? So the first is to select and define your standards. So this little triangle kind of represents the stages that QV Scribe can help with. So the first is the individual level. So how an individual writes requirements, that's improved by QV Scribe. So you've decided that this is the way that we're going to write requirements. At the next level is actually at the manager level. So at a team, you decide this isn't just how I'm going to write requirements, but this is how I want my team writing them. And QV Scribe is there to help make sure that everybody is on the same page. A future feature that we're working on right now and doing some discovery work on is that next level up, which is at the large organizational level. Are there more complex rules that an organization might want to use? So maybe for the use of words like normal, maybe it's okay in certain instances and it's not okay in others. And you want to customize the way that QV Scribe actually deals with those particular issues. So for example, the words minimum and maximum, well, those can be vague in some instances, but okay in others. So maybe if you're using the word maximum and there's a value within that same requirement, you want that flagged. Things like that that are just more complex than what we have now that are suitable for an entire organization to use. Those are helping people actually define what are the rules that we want our team to follow. Because if you don't have a standard in place, you can't point to it and say, hey, this is actually in violation of the standard that we discussed. So select and define your standard and then enforce that. So keep everybody on the same page with what's been written. We'll skip ahead here. So what we covered today was why we love requirements and think they're going to be around for a long time, how to plan and execute your review meetings, how to make the most of the investment that you're putting in. We're going to have a separate webinar later on the human factors in requirement reviews because we went a little long here and we don't want to keep you. So keep your eyes open for that upcoming human factors webinar. I think there's enough content there to do one on its own, so we'll do it that way. And there are also the steps that you can take to improve your process. So overall, I'd say make sure that you have a way that you want your team to write requirements. So you don't have to write your whole standard from scratch. You can start with the QV Scribe configuration library that we have. You can tell your team to follow the Incosia rules for writing requirements. You could choose to follow EARS or another method like that. But that's all going to be customized for your team. So as a next step, I would suggest If you're interested in learning more about kind of different approaches that are out there for managing your team and defining that standard for way you want your team to write your requirements, get in touch with us. Myself and also the other folks on my team, you'll be getting an email from Olivia very shortly with links to our survey on this webinar, but also you'll be followed up with someone from our team here to work with you on actually figuring out what is the best way for your team to manage their requirements. So we'd love to get in touch with you and to connect with you on that as well, and to talk through not just in general what are the best practices for requirement writing, but really what's the best approach for our team to use. Any other questions there so far? Nothing in? So I will quickly show, I'll bring up QVScribe for Polarian here. So since there was the question about integrations with different management tools, the one that I have on tap here is for Polarian, but we do have, we're actually further along with the development of the integration for DoorsNG. And this is basically what it looks like. We have one authoring workflow. So QVScribe will actually come up within the window itself as you're working on the requirement. So you can see in real time if you've made a change that's going to violate any of the best practices. And then also a review workflow, which is to take an actual set of requirements similar to what we just did with Microsoft Word and see those as a list. So just really quickly, this is Polarian, very similar to the way that DoorsNG is laid out, and JAMA as well. So you have an individual requirement here. We've designed an interface so you can select QVScribe from there or from the description here. So this is where in Polarian you'd actually edit the requirement. We'd insert a QVScribe icon there. So when you click that, it brings up this new interface for QVScribe. So from here, you can see the feedback, the response of what to do with each quality score is indicated there as well. So you can click through them and make changes. And then you can also go to this review workflow, which you can look at a set of requirements, and there's a similar workflow here within DoorsNG. So you can take a whole set of requirements. If I click it at that level, it will show me the quality score of all of those requirements together. I can see a dashboard of what the quality score of these different requirements are, and then which issues are being highlighted there as well to go in and make changes to them. So that's what's coming for our future with QVScribe. So we've seen a trend over the last several years as we've been monitoring this and working with QVScribe for Word and Excel. So today our customers that use requirements management tools are using it with our integration with Microsoft Excel. So you can export the requirement, make changes to it within Excel, and replace the requirement. What we've heard from a number of our customers is that they're migrating to a requirements management tool, or they're already invested in a requirements management tool, and that is a friction point for them to leave the requirements management tool to run the analysis and then go back in. And so for tools that are accessed through a browser, so like DoorsNG, Polarian, JAMA, which is really where the future of requirements management is going, we want to be right there within your workflow. So as you're working on your documents, we're there in that same environment to give you the feedback that's focused on. So we're not moving into requirements management. We think there's some great solutions that are already in place there with the examples that we showed there. So Polarian, DoorsNG, JAMA, Visual, and Helix, these different tools that are out there, we don't need to reinvent the wheel, but we think that helping people with the actual syntax of the words that you choose to use in your requirement is a really important issue. So that's what we're focused on, and we want to deliver those results in the workflows that you're already using. So we can unify your team and help keep everybody on the same page. I hope that helped answer your question. If there are any more questions, feel free to send me an email directly, james.carr@qracorp.com. If you do already have a contact here, feel free to reach out to them. If you have a contact here and don't know it yet, they'll be sending you an email in the next couple of hours as soon as the recording is available. So everybody that's on the call will get a copy of the tutorial. If you want those existing extra resources that we have included here, like a link to our EARS guide, the link to the Mastering the Review Process guide, as well as this link here, which is information about our IT and security and architecture. If you fill out that quick 2-question survey, we'll get that PDF over to you right away so that you can look through that extra content. So I guess we're at the end of our time here. So if there are no other questions, I will sign off. Watch for that email. Olivia should be sending it any moment here. So check your email. We'd love to hear from you on what you thought about the webinar. And for those of you that are watching on the recording, we appreciate you taking the time to watch this with us. And we invite you to get in touch if we can help any further. Thank you very much.